At 11:47 p.m. on a rainy November evening, my uncle stood in a grand ballroom wearing a $10,000 tuxedo, completely unaware that his entire empire, everything he'd built, everything he'd stolen from me, was about to crumble in the next 13 minutes. The music was playing, the champagne was flowing. He was toasting his own genius, and I was walking through the doors he thought he'd locked me out of forever. My name is Liam Vance, and this is the story of how I went from a prison cell to owning the man who put me there.
If you've ever felt powerless, if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever dreamed of the moment when the world finally sees the truth, then you need to watch this story until the very end. Because what my uncle did to me and what I did to him is one of the most satisfying acts of justice you're ever gonna hear. So hit that like button, subscribe, and let's go.
10 years ago, I was 22 years old, and I thought I had the world figured out. My father, Marcus Vance, was an architectural visionary, not just a guy who designed buildings, he was a thinker. For 30 years, he obsessed over one project, one single project. A smart city infrastructure system that would revolutionize how humans lived, worked, and connected. Imagine a city where buildings could communicate with each other, where traffic flowed like a nervous system, where energy was conserved through intelligent design. This wasn't science fiction to him, it was his life's work. And I was his son. I grew up watching him sketch blueprints at midnight, watching him argue with engineers, watching him refuse million-dollar deals because they didn't align with his vision. To me, he wasn't just my father. He was proof that obsession and integrity could coexist. When I turned 18, he brought me into Vance Innovations, not as a charity case, as his protege. He taught me everything: the technical architecture, the business principles, the ethical codes that should never be compromised. He'd say to me, "Liam, knowledge is the only asset they can't confiscate. Remember that." I didn't know how much I'd need those words. My uncle, Victor, Dad's younger brother, was always different, charming, ambitious, but there was something hollow about his charm. It was calculated. My father saw it too. I remember him telling me once, "Victor wants to build kingdoms. I want to build homes for people to live in them." That sentence held everything you needed to know about the difference between them. Everything changed on March 14th, 2014. My father had a heart attack in his office. Massive, fatal. He was 58 years old. I was 22, and suddenly, I was alone in a company worth billions, without a guide.
That's when Uncle Victor showed up. He didn't arrive as a snake, he arrived as a savior. He came to the funeral with tears in his eyes. He hugged me so tight I felt safe. He whispered, "We'll get through this together, Liam. I promise you. Your father would want me to help you." I believed him. God, I was so naive. For the first few weeks after Dad died, I was barely functional. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. suffocating. I couldn't eat. I'd walk through the office and see his empty desk and feel like the walls were closing in. Victor knew this. He watched it, and he moved. He started making himself indispensable. Board meetings? He'd be there, whispering advice into my ear. Financial decisions? He had the answers. Corporate strategy? Only he understood what my father had truly wanted. He was everywhere, filling every void, making himself seem essential to my survival. But the entire time, he was building a case against me. It started small. He'd mentioned casually that he'd noticed some irregularities in the company accounts. Nothing serious, probably just accounting errors from the transition. Then, a few weeks later, he'd express concern that certain financial transfers didn't have proper documentation. Each comment was planted like a seed. Then came the day that changed everything. I was in my apartment, a modest place, nothing fancy, when FBI agents knocked on my door. The shock of seeing their badges, hearing them say my name with that tone of voice, It was like being struck by lightning. They had a warrant. They had evidence, mountains of it. Millions of dollars had been siphoned from Vance Innovations into accounts bearing my name. Corporate secrets had been sold to competitors. Embezzlement, fraud, treason against the company my father built. I remember saying the same thing over and over. This is impossible. This isn't real. There's been a mistake. But there was no mistake. There was only strategy. Victor had planted digital footprints. He'd created forged documents, brilliant forgeries with my signature. He'd bribed a high-ranking federal judge named Richard Kessler with promises of board positions for his son. And worst of all, he'd turned my childhood friends against me. People I'd known since elementary school. He'd offered them money, opportunities, threats, whatever it took. And they testified that they'd personally witnessed me bragging about getting rich off Dad's legacy. The trial lasted 3 months. My defense was simple. I didn't do this. But Victor's narrative was seductive. He painted a picture of a grieving, unstable young man who'd been corrupted by sudden wealth and power. He brought in psychologists who testified about inherited trauma and moral instability. He presented each piece of planted evidence with the precision of a surgeon. The judge, completely compromised. The jury, convinced. I remember the moment the gavel came down. Not a sound, just silence. The word guilty echoed in that courtroom like it was being said in a cathedral. 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. As they led me away in handcuffs, Victor stood near the back of the courtroom. He made eye contact with me, and he smiled. Then he leaned over to the reporter next to him and said something I would never forget. "Some birds are meant for cages, Liam. Your father was a dreamer. I am a king." That sentence followed me into prison like a ghost.
Prison is one of two things, a graveyard or a forge. For the first 24 months, it was a graveyard. I was assigned to a cell block with men who had nothing to lose. I was angry, not the kind of anger that's explosive, but the kind that eats you from the inside out like acid. I was suicidal. I'd lie on my bunk at night and think about how easy it would be to not wake up. The only thing that stopped me was spite, pure spite. I wanted to live if only to prove that Victor hadn't broken me. But spite alone doesn't sustain you. One day, a prison librarian named Marcus, ironically same name as my father, asked me why I spent 14 hours a day in the library. I told him I was trying to disappear into books. He said something that shifted everything. If you're going to disappear, disappear upward, not downward. So I made a choice. I stopped fighting with my fists. I stopped joining gangs for protection. I stopped trying to survive. Instead, I decided to learn. For the next 8 years, I became a student of destruction. Not because I was planning revenge, at first I wasn't, but because my father's words kept echoing in my head. Knowledge is the only asset they can't confiscate. I taught myself international tax law. I studied corporate restructuring, forensic accounting, high-level cybersecurity. I read every book on leverage, power dynamics, and institutional collapse. I became obsessed with understanding how empires fall from within. But the real breakthrough came when I accessed my father's old personal files through the prison's limited internet access. In a cloud folder dated 2008, years before Victor even became relevant, I found something extraordinary. My father's original smart city blueprints, the complete architectural plans, thousands of pages of genius. But more importantly, I found his private notes. My father, being the paranoid visionary he was, had documented every potential weakness in the system, every shortcut that could work but shouldn't be taken, every vulnerability in the digital core management system. And most critically, he'd created a decoy set of blueprints, inferior ones, intentionally flawed, which he'd hidden in his office safe. He'd kept the real ones off the grid. And here's where fate intervened. When I was 12 years old, my father had walked me through the entire smart city system. He'd wanted me to understand it from first principles, and he'd given me a 64-digit master code that would unlock the core digital architecture. I'd memorized it as a game, a memory exercise. I never thought it would matter. But Victor had stolen the decoy blueprints from Dad's office. He'd assumed they were genuine, and he'd used them, shortcuts and all, to build his grand tower, a gleaming skyscraper that made him a billionaire, the building that symbolized his triumph over my family. That building was a disaster waiting to happen. In my prison cell, I realized something that made my heart race. Victor didn't have the real blueprints. Victor didn't have the code. Victor didn't know his greatest achievement was built on a foundation of sand. And I did. For the first time in 8 years, I felt something other than despair. I felt power.
The day I walked out of prison, I had nothing. A cheap suit, a bus ticket, the name Liam Vance attached to felon and fraud. No job prospects, no friends who would return my calls, no family except the man who destroyed me. But I had something Victor didn't know about, a secret account. Years before he died, my father had set up an offshore trust fund for my wedding. Yes, my wedding, something he desperately wanted to see. He'd never told Victor about it. It was untouched, forgotten, worth approximately $8.7 million. I took that money and I disappeared. For 18 months, I lived in Singapore under a false name. I rented a small apartment. I grew a beard. I kept my head down, and I built something in the shadows. I created a shell company called Aegis Holdings. I hired lawyers, accountants, and financial specialists who didn't ask questions. I purchased multiple layers of proxies and dummy corporations across 17 different countries. And then I began buying up Victor's debt. See, here's what Victor didn't understand about success. Arrogance makes you sloppy. He'd overextended himself. The Grand Tower was profitable, yes, but he'd leveraged it to the teeth to fund new projects. He was like a man standing on stilts, impressive to look at, but fundamentally unstable. Every month, I'd buy another chunk of his corporate debt through Aegis. Insurance companies, pension funds, venture capitalists, they all sold to me without suspicion. I was just another faceless investment firm. For 18 months, I accumulated $1.2 billion of his obligations. Then I waited for him to need me. It came in the form of the Diamond Anniversary Gala. Victor was planning to announce a global merger with a Chinese development firm that would cement his legacy. The deal required a $500 million cash injection immediately. His banks were tapped out. His investors were hesitant. He was desperate. And that's when Aegis Holdings called. I'll never forget the moment he took the bait. Victor's representatives negotiated the terms with my lawyers. They signed a loan agreement, 300 pages long, meticulously crafted. On page 242, buried among pages of financial jargon, was a clause that would become his undoing. Moral and structural integrity clause. In the event the borrowing entity is found guilty of prior fraud, embezzlement, or corporate malfeasance, or if a material structural defect rendering the primary asset uninhabitable is discovered, all board members and signatories shall forfeit personal assets totaling 150% of the loan amount to the lender. He didn't see it. His lawyers missed it. Or maybe they saw it and thought it didn't matter. They were wrong, because I'd prepared for this moment with meticulous precision. I'd hired private investigators to recover evidence from the original trial, evidence that was lost or destroyed. I'd accessed cloud servers that had been forgotten for a decade. And most importantly, I'd recovered the high-definition security footage from the courthouse parking garage on the day my father died. On that footage, there was Victor, signing the forged documents with Judge Kessler. Clear as day, undeniable, damning. I had my proof. I had my leverage.
I had my moment.
The night of the Diamond Anniversary Gala. I hadn't seen my uncle in 10 years, not since that day in the courthouse when he smiled at me like a predator who'd successfully cornered his prey. The event was at the Grand Tower itself, his monument to greed. 3,000 people, celebrities, politicians, business titans, everyone who mattered in his world was there to celebrate him. The man had orchestrated his entire narrative, the boy who built an empire, the visionary, the king. I walked through the front doors at 11:34 p.m. I wasn't on the guest list, but I owned the building by then, or rather Aegis did. Security didn't stop me. I owned their payroll. I made my way to the main server room on the basement level. Upstairs, Victor was in his element. I could hear the orchestra, the murmur of admiration. He was probably telling that story again, the one about discovering a brilliant shortcut that no one else had seen, the story about his genius, the story about my father's outdated methods and his own superior vision. At 11:47 p.m., I triggered the sequence. The giant LED screens behind the stage flickered, the music cut out, the entire ballroom went silent, that moment of confusion before chaos, and then the video began to play. High-definition footage of Victor, 15 years younger, sitting at a desk with Judge Kessler, and in his hands the forged documents, his hands shaking as he signed my name, his voice audible even through the video. Once the kid goes away, the company is mine, all of it. 3,000 people watched their hero reveal himself as a criminal. But the video was only the appetizer. At 11:51 p.m., I triggered what I called the core alert. The entire building's emergency systems activated simultaneously. The lights turned blood red. Alarm sirens wailed so loud people covered their ears. The sprinkler systems began to flood specific sections of the Grand Tower, the structural weak points my father had warned against in his original notes. The building's state-of-the-art digital core management system, the one powered by my father's blueprints that Victor had stolen and modified, began to fail catastrophically. Elevators stopped, fire doors sealed. The building, within seconds, was declared structurally unsound and legally uninhabitable. I walked through the chaos, up the stairs, through the panicked crowd. I stepped onto the stage. Victor was standing there, frozen. His face had gone from red to white to gray. His champagne flute had fallen to the ground. He was looking at the screens, at the video, at me. "Liam?" he stammered, like he'd seen a ghost. Maybe he had. I leaned into the microphone. I made sure the entire world could hear me, and I said exactly what needed to be said. "Uncle, you told me some birds are meant for cages. It looks like you finally found yours." 11 minutes later, FBI agents were leading him out of the building in handcuffs. 12 minutes later, the moral and structural integrity clause was invoked. He lost his mansion, his cars, his private jet, everything. Victor was arrested on the same charges he'd fabricated against me: fraud, embezzlement, corruption of a federal official. The evidence was airtight, inescapable, and it came from the man he underestimated. As he was being pushed into the police car, I stood outside in the rain. The building my father had designed was behind me, gleaming even in its damaged state, and I finally felt peace.
There's a lesson buried in this story that goes beyond revenge. It's about patience. It's about the difference between reacting and acting. Victor expected me to come at him with rage and desperation. Instead, I came at him with strategy and time. Justice isn't always immediate,
But when it's earned, when it's real, it's worth the wait. I didn't take the money from the settlement. I used it to create a foundation for families of wrongfully convicted inmates, because the real victory wasn't destroying Victor, it was becoming better than he could ever be. If this story gave you chills, if you felt that rush of justice, hit that like button hard. Subscribe to this channel, because we've got more stories like this coming that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Drop a comment below. What's the most satisfying act of justice or karma you've ever witnessed? I want to hear your stories. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe, because in a world full of victors, we need more Liams. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.